Hello everybody, this is Stonewall, and as you can see from the title of this video, it's going to be a little bit different. So by reality check, I mean, how does it compare to real life? So I know video games like this are not even marketed as being based in full reality or trying to be as realistic as possible. But there's some things that I come across and it just makes me shake my head a little bit. So we're looking at the ammunition types in Blackout. So I have been playing Blackout a decent amount lately, and notice the way the ammunition is done is kind of strange. So I'm just going to scroll through the weapons and talk about which ones make sense, which ones don't make sense, and what ammunition they use in Blackout. Starting with the assault rifles, most of these make sense, but there's a few caveats that I have here. So this, of course, uses 5.56 ammo, which makes perfect sense for this platform. That's exactly what a gun like this would use. This uses 7.62. Now, this is where we get into a little bit of an issue with what they mean by 7.62 millimeter. And that is, there are so many different rounds that use that same diameter projectile, it's not even funny. So in this case, I'm assuming they mean 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO, which is in English units, that's going to be basically the equivalent of a 308 Winchester round. And that makes sense for this, as it's pretty much based off of the SCAR 17, which uses that round. Next one's the KN57, which is kind of based off of the AK-12, which is the replacement for the AK-47 in the Russian military. Now, the issue I have here is the AK-12 actually uses a 5.45 by 39 millimeter projectile, a little bit closer to the 5.56 that the other kind of standard has become, well, the NATO standard has become. So in Blackout, they have it using a 7.62 again, which if it was a standard AK, or an AK-47 that is, then it would use 7.62 by 39. Now, there's a big difference between 7.62 by 39 and 7.62 by 51. They will not function in each other's guns. But I can understand simplifying things in order to not have, 15 different types of ammunition in Blackout. But again, if they wanted to do that, that would change the meta a little bit, and you'd probably wind up swapping weapons a lot more often and running out of ammunition a lot more often if they had the many different types of ammunition that should be represented here. Next is the Vapor. Now, this uses 5.56, if I remember correctly, in Blackout. And I don't know, there's part of me that thinks that this should actually be the 300 Blackout cartridge. This is one of the few assault rifles that you do actually get to put a suppressor on, so that would make pretty good sense. And that's actually the round that the Honey Badger from Call of Duty Ghosts would have used. Next we move on to the Maddox, and it uses 5.56 as well. The only question I have is looking at the curvature of the magazine. It more closely matches the 5.45, so just a little bit different there. Of course, it is an extended magazine. It's 40 instead of 30 that you get in the ICR, but just a little bit different. Now, by the way, I don't want this to come across as all negative against the game, because I know it's not intended to be this extremely realistic combat experience. But it just kind of maybe should come across as constructive, something a little bit different, or things they could think about. Next, you have SMGs. Now, looking at these, most of these should be 9mm. The MX-9, of course, uses 9mm in Blackout. I think the GKS uses 45. I'm not so sure about that one. If it's based off of the old H&K then that might be the case. It might actually be a 45. The Spitfire makes less sense than the GKS in that the weapons that it's visually based off of are 9mm, and most of the 45 caliber SMGs are not going to have as high of a fire rate just because of the size of the projectile, which means the mass of the bolt reciprocating and the amount of energy that takes to do it that quickly. Anyways, if that makes sense. The cordite is listed as 9mm. Now that would be okay, but we can see the ammunition in the magazine. This is a bottleneck cartridge, which means the diameter of the cartridge steps down to the diameter of the projectile, or closer to it, which means there's more space for gunpowder, which means it should be a much higher velocity projectile. And this gun is based off of the FNH P90, which uses a 5.7 by 28mm round, which is, I would say, a relatively new round. It's become a lot more prevalent in some law enforcement. I think even some local law enforcement are carrying 5.7s and P90s. It's kind of interesting. But it should be 5.7. Now, this would be the only gun in the game to use it, so I can understand simplifying down to 9mm. Again, making the game more simple, easier to find ammo for your gun whenever you're looting, that sort of thing. Next is the SOG, and again, this makes perfect sense for 9mm. That's what the gun should be. Tactical rifles. I believe this uses 7.62, which again makes sense, but as the 7.62 by 51 NATO. Same round as the Rampart. So that makes sense. The ABR uses 5.56, and it's kind of interesting that it's designated the ABR 223, which 223 is the, I guess, English measurement that is close to the equivalent of the 5.56. There's some argument as to whether or not they are equivalent. That's not a discussion I'm getting into in this video. Swordfish, again, 5.56. Makes sense. The gun kind of reminds me of the F2000, the FNH F2000 in build here, or visually. Now, the light machine guns. This uses 7.62, which I guess kind of makes sense. It would be a 7.62 of 51, but this is actually a caseless light machine gun, and so that's going to use a little bit different ammunition. Next comes up the Hades, which supposedly uses 5.56, and it makes sense as the gun is based off of the M249 SAW, which uses 5.56. Now the VKM supposedly uses 50 caliber. Now, there's not very many very mobile 50 caliber light machine guns. Now, this is based off of, I believe it's the PKM, I could be wrong on that, and that uses a 7.62 by 54. But you can actually look and visually inspect the cartridges here, and they are not rimmed cartridges, so it's not the 7.62 by 54R. I'm not exactly sure what this would be, but I don't believe it would be 50 caliber in reality. Now, sniper rifles, this one makes sense as the 50 BMG. The biggest issue I have with it is how short the cycle is for the bolt. So it is a manual straight pull bolt on the left hand side, which is kind of unique. But as you can kind of see, the travel distance for that bolt is about half the length of the magazine, which would cause feeding issues if it's just a simple bolt action. So there may be something else going on behind the scenes with that. Next we have the Outlaw, which deserves an episode all to itself. It has many, many realistic issues with it, and I will probably do a video about this one, but it's listed as 338. Now, the biggest issue I have here is the magazine capacity. This should be it would be pushing it to have a 6-shot 338 cylinder on that. Maybe in the future they get some better technology than what we have now. But it doesn't make sense for that to hold 9 rounds. So next we have the SDM, which is basically a souped up M14. There is one very similar to this, and it's been in previous Call of Duty games. I think all the way back to Ghosts and maybe before that, was the M14 Mod O EBR, which is essentially a designated marksman rifle for the military. Now, the round this uses in real life is the 7.62 x 51 NATO. In this game, it uses the 338. Now, as far as I'm aware, there are no 338 semi-automatic firearms. Now, I could be mistaken on this. I just don't know at this point. But just kind of interesting, and it could conceivably be an upgrade to the M14 to change the caliber out. Next up we have the Koshka, which again uses 338, which is very interesting whenever you look at the curvature of the magazine. So whenever you look at the magazine at the very back of the stock, it's kind of a bullpup design. You compare that to the magazine on the SDM, which is basically straight. The main purpose of the curvature of a magazine is because most projectiles are a little bit larger at the back end than the front. Looking at the cordite, you can see the bottleneck cases. The projectile is smaller around than the back of the casing, which makes sense, and that's why most magazines are curved like this. But this one has quite a curve on it compared to the other guns that supposedly use the same ammunition. It's also a little bit shorter front to back, which makes me wonder if it could actually handle the 338. I don't think it's quite long enough for that. It looks more like a 7.62 x 39 magazine, which is a little short for a sniper round. But anyways, so that's all of the long guns. Let's move over to the secondaries. Now, the Strife, I have no issue whatsoever. It reminds me of the H&K USP, which is a 45, and it's a 45 in Blackout. So it has the similar rail as the USP. It's actually ported, but it's kind of ported in an odd spot. Most of the time they're extended out, and I don't remember for sure. I think most of the time the port is in front of the front sight. Not sure if this would cause issues, because most of the time a ported barrel is going to leave a little bit of a fireball above the port there. So you're going to be having trouble seeing your front sight, especially if you're shooting in the dark. Now, again, that's another little bit of a reality check on that gun, as that is. Now, don't get me started on extended mags. I will do an episode on some of the attachments throughout. The RK7 Garrison, based on the Beretta 93R, makes perfect sense. It is a 9mm in real life, so that's perfectly fine. Now, what I'm curious about is the texturing at the end of the muzzle. It actually gets bigger, and there's not space. But it doesn't appear to be a thread protector. Most of the time, whenever there's that type of knurling on the outside of a barrel, it's because there is a thread protector there in order to put a suppressor on that and not damage your threads whenever you don't have your suppressor on it. So it just looks a little bit out of place because it's not a compensator or anything of that nature. It doesn't do anything functional as far as I can tell. Also, the sight radius is a little short, but that's, again, a small thing. Next, we have the Mozu. Now, this one supposedly uses 45 caliber ammunition. Now, they don't specify which 45, but 45 ACP would be an issue in a revolver. You'd have to use moon clips or something like that to retain the ammunition in the cylinder, as 45 ACP does not have a rim like 45 long Colt or something like that does. What this appears to be based on, or what it reminds me the most of, is the Chopper Rhino, which is a 357 Magnum handgun and a 6-shot revolver. The cylinder shape actually is pretty much spot on for that gun. But this is probably the only complaint in the secondaries. The shotguns make sense as being 12 gauge because this being based on the AA-12, and this, I'm not exactly sure what this one is based on exactly, but they both would make sense to be 12 gauges. The launcher, I'm not sure, it just says rockets, so I can't really critique that much. Outside of when you put rocket cache or cache, or however you want to pronounce that, on there, it appears to use 40mm grenades. It's kind of odd. Anyways, so that kind of wraps up the whole ammunition and the different types of ammo being used in Blackout. And I'm sure I'll probably do more episodes on various attachments and different things that, whether they would be realistic and actually make a difference on a gun or not, particularly on the Outlaw. It's probably the worst offender in the game in terms of realism. So it will probably get an episode by itself. But I just wanted to throw this out there, clarify some things, and hopefully be a little bit educational. Hopefully you learn something from it and enjoy that. So if there's anything you'd like me to discuss or any challenges you'd like to see me do, please leave that down in the comment section below, and I will catch you in another video.